Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning into the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and we've got a show for the ages in store for all of you today. And as we know, baseball is rapidly approaching, and with opening day being on Thursday next week, the 23rd, as of today of recording, July 17th, it's going to be an opening day like none other, as the season will be starting over 4 months late. That's right, 4 months, something that we have never seen before. And what will also be new is the no fans, obviously. And for me, being at the ballpark on opening day is a feeling in sports that's really incredible and something that I've always appreciated and I've always cherished. And because of the memories I have going to opening day with friends and family, it will be very unfortunate that we won't be able to go and attend games and really attend opening day at all. And trust me, I'm going to miss going down to PNC Park here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I'm located, and catching a Buccos game. It's been a big time weird situation, this entire quarantine, this entire pandemic, but it's going to be even weirder not being able to go down to the point downtown in Pittsburgh to see those games and also to check out that beautiful view of the city. But nonetheless, we have baseball returning, and no matter what, I think we'll all agree that we can, be happy and be appreciative that at least there is going to be some sports and especially baseball coming back very soon. Again, thanks for joining me today, everyone. There is a lot to cover in the baseball world, and with the season rapidly approaching, less than a week away, I want to get into some things that we'll be looking at and being prepared for coming up this season, but also to think about after the season, after the years to come, once COVID-19 gets through and runs its course in the post-COVID world in baseball. So for today's show, I'll open things up in segment 1, discussing some predictions for this season and which teams could really benefit from this shortened 60-game format. There's going to be some teams that can really jump out to some quick starts. I'll go over a couple teams that I think could really benefit from this, and also give a couple honorable mentions of some teams that were also last year very, very good through the first 60 games and could also benefit and make a big run during the first portion of this season. Following our first bit of the show, I'll next get into a topic that has been very popular lately in baseball, and that is how this season will be viewed in history and how it will go down in the record books. I'll share my thoughts on how it should be viewed and some statistics that could be greatly inflated because of the shorter season. Afterwards, I want to dive into the world of the taxi squad and what the future holds for minor league baseball and scouting. Many leagues are starting to cut teams, so that will greatly impact how teams can evaluate and scout talent in the future. So I'll dive into that and investigate what that might look like in the coming years. And to wrap things up in my fourth and final segment today, I'm going to be giving my top 3 greatest worst to first year turnarounds in baseball history. I'll discuss which teams they were, their improvement in that one year, and what their season outcome was the season after their disastrous finish. So stick around for those last few minutes of the show. That'll be a quick history lesson for everybody, and I hope I can leave you all with some newfound knowledge to go into the rest of your day with. Now, I want to dive into our first segment today with some predictions for this season, because I think that with this abbreviated playing, there's going to be a lot of teams that could really benefit from this 60-game format. And again, to say that this is going to be a unique season is a complete understatement, because this is a season that we have never seen before. Teams are going to be playing a fraction of the usual games that are usually played in the MLB season, and it's going to be weird. It's going to be a very, very weird year, but nonetheless, it'll be also very exciting. There's also some really exciting, cool new rules that are going to be implemented and some new formatting that's going to change the way baseball is and has been for a very, very long time. So I'll get into my predictions as to who I really think could actually make an impact early on in the season and ultimately really benefit from this shortened format. So to kick it off, I'm going to go with an NL East team that last year came in second place through the first 60 games, but wound up actually winning winning the division, and that's the Atlanta Braves. They were very, very good last year, and they've been very good for the last few years, and they're a team that I've always have told people to watch out for, mainly because they've got a great hitting core. Freddie Freeman, one of the best first basemen in both the MLB and the NL, and they've got a great young core of guys, Ronald Acuna Jr. and Ozzie Albies, highlighting those young superstars that they have, and those guys are going to be around in the league for years to come. They're going to have long careers, very illustrious careers, and it's going to be exciting to watch them play and see how they bloom into players much further into their career. Another name to throw out is Dansby Swanson. He's the guy that came in for the Braves, highly touted, and he did start off a little shaky in the early part of his career from the plate, but he's always been a good fielder, and he got a lot better as the year went on from the plate. So again, some more half glass full things to look at if you're a Braves fan. And again, last year they were 33-27 at that 60 game mark through the first 60 games. And if they can stay consistent through the entire season right now, able to keep on churning through and getting wins, again, it might not be teams that win 40, 45 games that go to the World Series. It could be teams like the Braves or other teams that usually have, 30, 35, maybe pushing 40 wins through the first 60 games usually. It could be a team like that. It could be a team that is starting to peak and to climb at the right point of the year. And also, not to mention, they're a team that can get a lot of guys on base. They can also drive a lot of runs in. They compiled 619 walks as a team last year, and they had a 789 OPS, which was 7th in the MLB. Top 10 in that statistic in the league. If you're able to get that many guys on base, first off, 619 walks, if you think about it, that's a lot of walks to have for a team. And if you're able to drive in, let's say about a third of those runs, you're doing a really good job. Even if it's 2/3 of those runs, you're doing an impressive job. And so it's going to be crucial to try and put these teams away early on in the year. And so the Braves are going to have to really try and jump out to early leads in games, and they cannot afford dropping the first 7 of 10 games or 8 of 11 games. They cannot afford to get in a hole, but I really don't think they will. I think they're a team that is going to really pace themselves, but also go in with a lot of focus because, again, you cannot use the excuse that you're tired or exhausted come game 55 or 60 because it's not going to be an 162 game season. It's just not going to be like that. So as a result, players have to kind of bite the bullet a little bit and deal with it. And it's not that bad. 60 games is a fraction of what they're used to playing, so guys are going to come in much more focused and much more determined. But I really do think that this year, the Braves, they can be a team with a lot of potential, and they could definitely make some noise in this abbreviated year. Now, another team that I want to get into out west that has had a fair bit of struggle, but has had some very talented players and actually has arguably the best baseball player in the MLB on their roster, and that's the Angels. Last year, they were 29-31 at the 60-game mark, so they had a losing record through the first 60 games. I know people might say, why are you picking this team? And here's why. They picked up a big-time offseason acquisition in Anthony Rendon. They got him from the Nationals, had a career year last year, hit .319 with 34 homers and 126 RBIs. They also have Brian Goodwin. They've got Shohei Ohtani, and they've got Albert Pujols. He's still putting up good numbers. He hit 20-plus home runs last year. And I mean, he's not hitting for the average that he used to, and he's by no means the typical hitter that he was in his earlier career. But he's still a very productive player. He still is able to produce from the plate and get things done for his team offensively. This is a team that can make a lot of noise. Now, here's the caveat, though. Mike Trout has said that he's going to take it day by day and play it by ear a little bit with this season and how things are going to go with the pandemic. Why? Well, because his wife is expecting a newborn. So, again, like many other players might run into that issue, some of these guys are going to have familial things and people at home that they cannot afford getting sick and possibly bringing something inside of the house that they might not otherwise know that they brought in. So guys like Mike Trout, if they sit out, it could really, really affect the way that the Angels are going to play. It could really, really hinder their performance and their success. And I don't want to say that everything is riding on Trout, but for the most part, he does do a lot, and he's a guy that's 40-plus homers in multiple years, consistently ranks as one of the best RBI guys each and every year. But, again, they've had him for years. So, although they've had him, they haven't had the success that you would think would line up with having a guy like that. I think having Rendon is going to add that added piece that they need, that added building block in their lineup that's going to ultimately push them into a big-time playoff contention. Now, another thing to be worried if you are a fan of the Angels, and I hate to bring this up, but they were one of the 5 worst teams in the MLB last year in team ERA. They had over a 5 ERA as a whole. And with that flimsy pitching, that could potentially be a problem for them. That could be a big time issue because a couple games, other teams get out to early leads and they rock their starting pitchers. Again, the Angels are just going to start piling up losses, and all of a sudden we're going to be in, game 35 of the season and they've only won 15 games. So it's going to be a matter of, can the pitching perform and can the pitching improve from last year, or are they going to continue to struggle? So it's going to be interesting. I'm very curious to see whether or not Trout does play, and if he does, how him and Rendon's bats mix together in the lineup. And I really think that they can do a lot of damage this year in the short amount of time that they do have. Now, the third team that I want to discuss, a team in the AL Central Division that has been making a ton of noise and has been one of the best teams in the AL each of the last 3 or 4 years, and that's the Minnesota Twins. Again, a team that is due for a big year, finishing in first last year and second the 2 years prior. So a team that's been right up there in the AL Central the last couple years. They make a lot of noise each and every season. Through the first 60 games, they were 40-20 last year. So again, that just goes to show that they're able to come out of the gate swinging, and they can come out to a very quick start, but they're a team that tends to fizzle out as the year goes on, and as they get more and more into the year and closer to the playoffs, and really in the playoffs, they seem to just not have the stamina or the durability that some of these other teams have. And with only 60 games, they can really keep that momentum going. They won't have to worry about guys getting fatigued because, again, that can't be an excuse. Guys are going to have to still be fresh, and are going to probably still be fresh in the 50, 55, even 60 game mark when the season is wrapping up. Guys are still going to be in full swinging playing mode. They're going to be ready to go, and they're going to be at the peak of their performance and their stamina of the season. And if they can keep that momentum rolling, they can go into the playoffs kind of with the mentality like, hey, this is essentially the same time right before the All-Star break, and we usually play some of our best ball during that time. Let's turn up the notch and let's keep rolling because we can really make a lot of noise. A team that hasn't gone to the ALCS since 2002. So 18 years they haven't made it past the ALDS. That is a long time. So they're primed for a big year and potentially a breakout season, really. And I don't want to speak too early, but this is a team that I could definitely see emerging as a World Series contender and making a legitimate run for it. Again, having players like Nelson Cruz, Miguel Sano, Eddie Rosario, and Mitch Garver. Those guys and many other players that they've got in that lineup are why they've been so successful and why they've been able to produce on the field that they've done the last couple years. Mitch Garver is one of my favorite underrated players in the league, had a breakout year, catcher for the Twins, batted around 290, 295 last year. He's going to be a dangerous player. I think he's going to be a guy that could really benefit from this shortened season and potentially have himself another career year, if not even better than he did last year. So I'm really excited to see Garver in action and also just the Twins in general. And I think it's going to be a team that you have to watch and have to pay attention to, especially as we get closer to the postseason. So the last team that I could definitely see making a deep push and really benefiting from this short season, it's not going to come as a shock. And I know a lot of people will say, well, I probably saw this one coming. And if you didn't see this one coming, it probably would be one of the top 3 choices that a lot of people would have as a favorite for the World Series. And that's the LA Dodgers. I mean, this team is stacked. I mean, from top to bottom, first 7 guys are all dangerous in their lineups. They could really pose an issue for some opposing pitchers. I mean, there could be some pitchers that are going to get shelled by the Dodgers. They have Mookie Betts, acquired in the offseason by the Boston Red Sox, and he's just leading off. That's just scratching the surface of many other very, very talented players that are going to follow right after Betts. Cody Bellinger hitting cleanup. And when you've got Justin Turner and Max Muncy hitting in between those guys, being sandwiched by Bellinger and Betts, that is just a recipe for runs if you're the Dodgers. I mean, you are going to see, I think you could really see in this, especially in this short season, I could see the Dodgers really coming out. I mean, I've been saying coming out hot, but I mean, literally coming out on fire in the first 30 games of the season. I mean, they're a type of team that from the beginning to the end of the year, it seems like they just continue to keep getting better. They just keep climbing up. They keep exponentially getting better and better as the year goes on. And with guys like these said players, Mookie Betts, Cody Bellinger, Justin Turner, even Corey Seager, Jock Peterson, guys that you see even further down in the lineup. I mean, you're getting into the 6 and 7 hole hitters, and you're talking about guys that could hit 20, 30 home runs in a season, in a normal season. So, I don't know what that would be equivalent to right now with everything that's going on, but you could see guys like Jock Peterson hitting for a lot of home runs, driving in a lot of runs. Max Muncy has been one of the big power hitters in the NL last few years. And Justin Turner, I mean, they've got a great guy at the hot corner over at third base. It's going to be fun to watch the Dodgers. I mean, I'm not a big Dodgers fan, and it really pains me to say that they're going to be a fun team to watch. But, I mean, they're going to be a team to definitely keep an eye on because, again, they're a lot of people's World Series favorites. And mainly why, and a big part of that is because of their ability, again, I keep going back to it, but their ability to drive in runs. As a team, they were 4th in the league in team OPS last year, and that just says right there, if you're adding Mookie Betts to a team that already drives in many runs, and a guy that had a 915 OPS last year as a leadoff guy, right there, you already know, 7 out of 10 times, maybe even 6 out of 10 times, Mookie Betts is going to get on base, and somehow, some way, he will score. However that might be, whatever way that might be, it doesn't matter. He is going to get home, and it could really, again, it could pose a major issue for teams that are going to be competing with the Dodgers. And if you get further down to that lineup and they're starting to do damage and you get that entire first 7 guys in a really hot streak in a game, it's going to be an uphill climb for another team. Now, another problem, or a main problem, I should say, that the Dodgers have that should be a little bit of a red flag if you were a fan, is their rotation. Their pitching rotation is not so hot right now. David Price has decided not to play because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Hye-In Jin Ryu was lost over the offseason to the Blue Jays. And now Clayton Kershaw, we never know what's going on with him. He's a big question mark in terms of health. Is he going to stay healthy? Is he going to be able to play these, entire 60 games? And again, I'm sure people will say, hey, he's able to play an entire season. He's capable of it. Well, yeah, it was just 60 games. It's not 162. That's a big time difference. So we'll see if Kershaw's stamina and his durability can go the entire season and really into the postseason. That's kind of been their big issue the last couple of years, is him falling and him getting injured kind of the midway point of the season. And then once they get into the postseason, they don't have that X factor. And honestly, they've gotten to, that pivotal point of the season, World Series, NLCS, the last couple of years, and it's just been that one piece. And it seems to be Clayton Kershaw every single time. So if he can stay healthy, if they can manage the rotation, I know they've got Walker Buehler, who's one of the best young pitchers in the MLB. If they're able to manage that and take care of that, and their hitters do the job that they're supposed to do, it's going to be a smooth sailing season for the Dodgers. It's really going to be a cakewalk for them. Now, 2 teams that I want to briefly mention that would be big time honorable mentions for me that I could definitely see potentially making a lot of noise in this first 60 games of the season, and also not only because of that, but not only because of their track record and what they've done in previous years, but also how they were last year and their offseason acquisitions. One of those teams being the Chicago White Sox. I think the Chicago White Sox are one of the best teams that are coming up to the surface right now. I think adding Yasmani Grandal, Tim Anderson's coming off a huge year. They've got a great minor league system. They've got a lot of promise and a lot of potential moving forward, and they're a team that could definitely make a run for it. And it will be interesting to see how they fare in that AL Central with the Twins. And I think it's honestly going to be the Twins and them and the Indians really trying to battle it out for the top dog in that AL Central. And on the other side, on the counterpart of the AL Central, the NL Central, the Pittsburgh Pirates. The Pirates were 1 or 2 games behind the Cardinals come All-Star break last year. They were in second place. After having a disastrous second half of the season, they really, fell off, and they eventually completely went out of the playoff race. And it was just a dismal fall off by them. It was historic. There was a point where I believe they only won 4 games over a 30-game stretch. It was something that was just astronomical that I have never seen in my entire life. And being that I am in Pittsburgh, you felt it. And I'm not even a Pirates fan, and you just felt that the air in the stadium and everything around the Pirates, you just knew that it was just negative because of their second half of the season. There was so much promise going into that second part of the season with a great first half. I mean, they started off pretty slow in the beginning of the year, but then they really started to pick it up. And they were going to, I think if they had not had the injuries and the lack of performance from guys that they did, I definitely think that they could have made a lot more noise, and they could have probably gone a lot further into the season. They probably might have even made a bigger push for the playoffs. So we'll never know. But again, they're a team, and honestly, I think a lot of people would agree that they're a team that they can come out hot, and they're the atypical team to come out hot, and a team that usually in a normal setting would peter off and just fall down, just absolutely go on a downhill trend in the second half of the year. Now, with no second half of the year really existing, this, again, could be a perfect opportunity for the Pirates to make a move to strike. Now, they're going to be kind of in a rebuild stage. They're going to have a new manager, but it's going to be a fun season to watch how the Pirates are able to respond and react to this 60-game season. I also, again, back to the White Sox, I am a big-time believer in the White Sox. I not only think that they can make a big push this year, but I think in the coming years. I mean, they've got a great minor league system. I'll actually get into one of their top minor league players later on in my third segment today, and he's a very talented player. I don't want to give him away yet, but he's a very talented player, and he's one of many that they have in that organization that could really impact the outcome and the years to come for this White Sox team. So I'm very excited to watch the White Sox and the Pirates, two teams in their counterpart leagues, and how they not only go against the teams in their respective divisions, but also head-to-head. I mean, the White Sox and the Pirates, that's going to be a very interesting matchup, something that you don't see very often, and we will see quite a bit of it this year. So, I mean, that's going to be a treat. I think that's another thing to look forward to this year, is the new matchups that we'll get to see much more often than we usually would, and I think that might even bud some new rivalries, some new, matchups that might not have ever been given the time of day before because of interleague, but now because of the season, it's going to be paid attention to. It's going to be a fascinating season, everybody, and I am excited, as I'm sure everyone at home is also. So that's going to wrap it up for our first segment today, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. Don't go anywhere, though, because after the quick break, I'll be back discussing our topic for segment 2, which will be how the season will go down in history and how it will be viewed in the record book. Sit tight, folks, because we will be right back after this break here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back, everyone, to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer again, and we had a really great discussion in segment 1 about what teams this season will benefit the most from this shortened season. And again, there's going to be a very small margin of error. You're not going to be able to come out to a slow start and be able to make some sort of miraculous second half comeback like you usually could in a 162-game season. Instead, 60 games, halfway point's going to be 30 games. And if you're in a losing record or in a losing situation through those first 30 or so games, you're pretty much, climbing the uphill and having a hard time getting to the top, because it's going to be a grind for you from that point on. Now, if you're a team that comes out hot and is able to keep that going, it could mean some big stuff come playoff time and come fall time, because if those teams are able to keep that momentum going and continuing on as the season goes, it could definitely pose to be a big run for certain teams into the World Series. Now, stick around, folks. Don't go anywhere later on, because I'll be giving my top 3 greatest worst to first in a year turnarounds in MLB history, a really fun segment that I think will give you all at home listening some newfound knowledge on some teams that you may not have known before. I knew very little about these seasons and what really culminated in them and what they really were all about, but I learned a whole lot more, and I hope that I can share and teach you all and educate you all on what happened that season as well, because I found a lot of really, really great stuff for sure. So in this segment, I want to kick it off talking about the historical significance of this season and how it's going to be viewed in the record books, and how are we going to look back at it in 10, 20, 30 years. And again, it's a season, like I keep mentioning, if you get in a slump where you can't, if you're a player, get a hit for 15 or 20 games, or if you're a team and you can't get a win for, God forbid, 10 or 15 games, you're going to be way behind. And again, we have a case here where there's no room for mess ups. If you're a player, if you're a team, if you're an organization, whomever, you really cannot mess up and have any sort of slow start or any sort of tough go about it in the beginning parts of the season, because it could really pose an issue later on in the season for you. Now, again, this is going to be a very unique and odd situation in this baseball season, so I'm going to reiterate a couple points and a couple parameters that are going to be new that have never been seen before in baseball. First off, the 60-game season. I mean, that's just right there very weird. I mean, we're used to 162 games. We're used to a very long season. That's going to be completely different this year. An expanded playoff format, obviously people love to have that, more playoffs, more postseason, and quite frankly, I mean, baseball playoffs is some of the most exciting stuff to watch, I think, in sports. I mean, it's so much fun to watch, and it's so, on the edge of your seat, kind of exhilarating and intense, really, to see what's going to happen, and wild card games are the best. I mean, even if you get into game sevens of the ALCS or World Series, I mean, those are some of the most monumental games in baseball and really in sports in general. There will also be teams that will be obviously playing each other in their respective divisions, but then they'll also play their cross-league counterparts. So, for example, the NL Central will play teams that are in the AL Central, and so on and so forth. Other divisions will also follow that same kind of parameter and kind of thinking as well. The trade deadline has also been moved back from July 31st to August 31st. Again, why would they have the trade deadline so close to the start of the season? Wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, so they're going to back it up to August 31st. And it's going to take people, I feel, a while to get used to this. And again, a little side note, it'll be interesting, and something that I kind of thought of, and a point that I have made to other people. If this is received well by fans, and if the players in the league and the organizations all like this shorter format, could we see a continuing of a smaller baseball season, a more spread out schedule, guys not playing so many back-to-back games, and things being, instead of condensed so much, even in such a large scale like an 162 game season, things that are, maybe an 82 or a 90 game season that are spread out a little bit more. Guys are playing, instead of 6 games a week, maybe 3 or 4, an extra day or 2 off, and some more rest for these players, because again, it's that factor of fatigue and tiredness that kicks in later on in the season for a lot of these teams. And again, this can't be an excuse, though. This season cannot be an excuse for that. You cannot, go up to your manager and say, hey, I'm really tired, I'm really sore. It's 60 games. Everybody's going to be locked and loaded. Everybody's been itching to play baseball. There's been a ton of time off. There's been plenty of rest. I think the big worry, and I think the big concern would probably be just whether or not guys are ready and the guys are in shape, because they're going to have very a little time to get prepared for this season. But a lot of people feel like this season will forever have an asterisk, and the winner of the World Series may be viewed in a totally different light than previous winners. And there's other people out there that completely disagree. I was out on the internet and I found an article written by Bob Nightingale of the USA Today, and he had a quote in there by Dave Roberts. And Dave Roberts is quoted by saying, quote, "There will be no asterisk," end quote, and talking about what will happen with this season and how it's going to be viewed. He went on to say that many of the obstacles that players and coaches are dealing with during this season, it could actually mean much, much more to whoever wins it, because they were able to be able to overcome that adversity and be able to get over, all of these odds that they've had to deal with, and that have been stacked up against them with the coronavirus and with all the uncertainty, with all the changing, with all the labor negotiations. I mean, there's been a whirlwind of problems with baseball. If you're factoring in the pandemic and then everything else that's been thrown on top of it, I mean, it's been a lot for people in baseball. So he makes a great point. It's definitely going to be a very challenging season, and it's definitely going to be it's going to feel all that much better when, a team is able to come out on top and be able to overcome all of this adversity, and really when all the chips are stacked up against a lot of these teams and they're able to come out on top and victorious. I mean, it's just that much sweeter when they win. So I definitely feel like, in my opinion, although I think Dave Roberts makes a very good point, and I'm not disagreeing with him, I think that he makes a very, very valid point. I could see a day where in the Hall of Fame, in some sort of brochure or in some sort of monument or some sort of exhibit, there's some sort of footnote and there's a little asterisk by this season, and it's explaining what happened this season, why there was so much fewer games. If there's a couple guys that are able to break some really big records, like, lowest ERA in a season, or highest OPS in a season, or highest batting average in a season, how or why were they able to break those almost, unbreakable records? It's because of this shortened season. Again, it's going to come back to that, and you're not going to be able to legitimately compare this season to really any other year because, again, it's just such a different layout. Guys are used to playing 162 games, and guys that are able to hit, 300, 350, in those really big number ranges in a 162 game season, I personally am going to look at with greater weight than opposed to a guy who might hit, 300 or 310 this year. Because again, it's only a fraction of games. It's 100 less games that they would be playing. And again, if you're going to see a player this year that might break Ted Williams' record, or if you're going to see a guy that's going to break, whomever's record, you're going to always hear after this year, what if Ted Williams had played this season? What if Mark McGwire had played in this season's format? So on and so forth. What if Randy Johnson had pitched in this era? Whatever it might be. And they'll always be comparing, if they had played in just 60-game season, they would have astronomical numbers. They would have unbelievable statistics. And you just really can't do that. I mean, it's comparing apples to oranges. I mean, if there was a season that I could somewhat try and compare this to, it would probably be a strike. It would honestly be as if there was, some sort of strike going on and the guys were able to, not play as many games. They could then maybe compare a season like this where there was a fraction of games played due to whatever. Again, this is a very unique situation, but there have been many strikes in baseball. And there was a couple times in the summertime, I would often forget that, there was a pandemic going on, obviously, in the world. I mean, I would obviously not forget that, but I would forget that the reason why baseball wasn't being played, it wasn't because of the pandemic, but it was because of these labor negotiations. A lot of the times I felt like there was a strike going on because there was just so much talk about that, and there was just so much building up with that subject. And it was almost every single day you were hearing about it. So it felt like there was something that was going to happen, some sort of labor deal that was not going to go through. And it's going to continue to be like that. Now, there are going to be some numbers that players could potentially surpass, and they could potentially break some records. One of them is being Ted Williams' infamous 400 batting average season that was set back in 1941. He hit 406, which is still the record to this day. It has never been broken, and there hasn't been many players to ever hit even 400 over a 60-game span. I mean, I went up and online and found the most recent person who did that, and that was Chipper Jones back in 2008. And it was during, a 60-game span, not necessarily from the first game to the 60th game, but just a 60-game, span. Over those 60 games, he was able to hit 409. And there were actually two players in 1997 that achieved that same feat, Larry Walker and Tony Gwynn. So this is something that players could reach and could attain. But again, will it be respected and will it be revered the same way as Ted Williams' record is normally? I really don't think so. I really think that no matter what, no matter which way you cut it, Ted Williams' record will live in infamy until somebody actually breaks it in a 162-game season. Because, again, that's the only way that you can really compare it. You have to put it up on the same scale. 162 games is way up above the ceiling, and a 60-game season is down at the ground floor. I mean, it's totally different points of view. And so, again, I have a hard time comparing two different things like that, and it would be really unfair to Ted Williams, who played the full season legitimately, hit above 400 an entire year. But on the other side, if someone does do that, and this year, and they will say, well, they couldn't control the fact that there was a worldwide pandemic and it's shortened baseball, and then there was, not as many games, there was an expanded playoff, there was a universal DH, so on and so forth. So either way, you're going to hear arguments for both sides. But I do believe that if there was somebody, or if there is going to be someone that breaks that record, like Ted Williams' prestigious batting average record, it has to be at least given some sort of footnote as to what happened that year, because again, what's going on right now is history and it can't be ignored. No matter where you look, no matter what's going on, this is going to be shared and educated and taught in sports, out of sports, no matter what. And if it's something that's going to be educated and taught outside of sports, then in sports, it should also be, shared and discussed, because it had just as big of an impact on sports as it did on really the entire society and everything, really. And there could be a lot of teams that could potentially, again, like I keep saying, benefit from this shortened game season. So it'll be interesting now to see what's going to be considered, a 100-win season or a 90-win season. What's going to be equivalent to winning 90 games or 95 games? I personally think that there's going to be some teams that might hit the 40-win mark. There probably will be, maybe 2 or 3 that hit low 40s, maybe 2 or 3 that hit mid 50s. But I really doubt we see anybody hit high 50s or high 40s and even in the 50s. I mean, I think it's going to be a 40 to 45 range if it's a top 3, top 5 team in the MLB, not quite into the 50s. But I think that for the most part, it's going to be a lot of teams in the 30s. And I think it's going to be those teams with those 30 win marks that are going to make all the noise. So I just don't really see how you're going to, again, compare, if a team wins 48-11 and then they go on to win the World Series, they're going to say, well, that was one of the best seasons that a team has ever had. How can you say that? They only won 48 games. They won, what normally would be a horrendous season. I mean, if you won 48 games in any other light in a 162-game season, you would be deemed as one of the worst teams, if not the worst team. So if you're going to, again, you could probably look at it at, the winning percentage or whatever. But even then, you're going to take a team that played 60 games and won 48 games, and then you have a team that played 162 games and only won 48 games. They both won the same amount of games. The only difference is the amount of games that was played in that overall pool. And because that there's just such a big difference, there's no way that they can be compared. People are going to have to know that they are totally different. They're 2 totally different entities. They're 2 totally different years. And so I think, they should, of course, count this season and take it very seriously. Obviously, I don't think that they should discredit it. I think they should definitely put this down in the Hall of Fame. Put this down as an exhibit. I mean, this will be monumental. This is going to be something that, we will be talking about for the next 20 years, and that we will always look back at, and there will always be that discussion, that talk of, what if this player had played in this kind of format in this type of season? What if this person had played in a whole 162 game season? So probably, any sort of footnote or asterisk is going to be next to any records, and even the World Series winner. I mean, whoever that is, there's just going to be a little side note or a footnote about what happened and what all went on with this pandemic and how it affected the season, because spectators are going to wonder, why there's a team that won the World Series that won 35 games in a year. People are going to scratch their heads in 30, 40 years who aren't alive right now and don't know what's going on. They're going to say, how in the world did a team win, 40 games, if that, and they went on to be a World Series champion? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Not to mention, it would become one of the most highly debated topics in baseball. Should the season of 2020 be viewed in the same light as other seasons? That's going to be something that, again, will be talked about for many, many years. But nonetheless, they need to explain in some manner in the record books what happened, because this is just such a unique situation that it will be something we probably will never see again, in all honesty. I mean, I know, there's been strikes, there's been various issues that have happened in baseball, but another thing that I'm very curious about is, could we actually see a change in the season? Could we see a change in the format? Could any of these changes that are going on this year actually stay permanently? I only think that the universal DH and maybe the expanded playoff would stay. I think those two would be the clear-cut favorites in staying and being permanent changes in the MLB. But again, the 60-game season, I mean, I know I said earlier that maybe if it's well received, people will like that and then they'll want to do that. But even then, I mean, guys are going to want to get paid. Guys are going to want to make money, and the more games, the more money. And these guys have massive contracts, and as a result, it's going to push guys in the direction of, hey, we want more games, we want more games, we want more games. And it was shown in those labor negotiations when the MLB would always come back, the Players Association would always come back with a counteroffer. I mean, that first counteroffer was 114 games. So they definitely want to play. They definitely want to get back out on the ball field. But if you're going to be a writer or a journalist or, whomever it is covering baseball in the next 25 years, you're going to have to ask yourself, how do you view this season? How do you write about this season? How do you go about covering teams that, were really successful? Are we going to see a team that, and I think, again, what's going to bring out this season ultimately will, potentially we could get, a fluke team. We could get a team that, might have a really great year, come roaring out of the gates, win 35, 40 games, go on deep down in the playoffs, and then they go back to their normal way, the next 10 years, and they continue to be bad. Let's say, for example, the Orioles. The Baltimore Orioles have not been good for many years. So let's say the Orioles, they come out to a really hot start. And again, because it's the season that it is, anybody can come out to a hot start, and it will change the entire outlook of the season. So they could come out, storming out of the gates, have a great year, go deep into the playoffs, and then come next year, come the following year, they go back to 162 games, and then all of a sudden they're back to square one, and everybody's asking, what happened to that Orioles team? I mean, they were so good back in 2020. I mean, why are they not the same team that they were back then? And same with players. There's going to be maybe a player or two that might just have a big 1 year, a big one hit, wonder, honestly, 1 year wonder, and after that, they just fall off, and you never hear about them ever again, because they were only good for, 35 games, for 60 games. They weren't good they couldn't play an entire 162 game season and legitimately, be a top tier player that is putting up, hefty numbers each and every single game. Again, going back to it originally, cannot compare apples to oranges, no matter which way you swing it, no matter which way you're pulling it. And again, yes, it will be hard. Going back to what Dave Roberts said, it will be challenging. It will be a monumental victory to whomever wins the World Series because of everything that's been going on and everything that's been circulating and going around the season. But when we look back at this in 20 years, we can't discredit, Mark McGwire hitting, 70-some home runs in a season. We can't discredit Ted Williams hitting 406 in a year. We can't discredit somebody throwing a sub-1 ERA as a starting pitcher. We can't discredit any of that in a 162 game season, but then go ahead and give all the credit in the world to, guys that are playing very well and performing at a high level in just this 1 year. It's going to be looked at in a totally different light, and there has to be an asterisk of some sort in some record book, in some footnote. And honestly, I think it would be very interesting, though. I mean, think about it. If you went to the Hall of Fame in about 10 years, there's going to be some sort of exhibit, or there's going to be some sort of explanation about this season. People are going to want to learn about it. And if anything, I think it will not ultimately be a season where we compare it to other years, but I think it's going to be a year that we look back at, and, there are going to be a lot of what ifs. There's going to be a lot of wondering of, if this format had continued, what kind of players could have continued to have that same success, could have continued to have a very good career, who was greatly affected by that short season, and then later on after that, they did not pan out to be the player that they were in that 1 year because, again, it was only a small sample size. It's going to be an interesting season. I know I keep saying that, but it's just so unique. We've never seen anything like this. And that's why there's just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unknown as to how we can look at it, how we can view it, as, us as journalists, writers, reporters, TV, air personalities, whatever you want to call us, announcers, so on and so forth. We're going to always question the season. We're going to always go back to the season, and I'm sure there's going to be many segments down the road and many kind of topics that will come out of this of, who's the best quarantine season player? Who was the best COVID-19 player? Whatever it might be. Who was the best player during the pandemic in that, that one pandemic year, that one pandemic season that the MLB had. So at the end of the day, I think all we can do is just appreciate that there's baseball and be thankful that, there's going to be a season, and we're going to look at this in a historic sense and in a very impactful sense, but we're also going to take it with a grain of salt because we cannot ignore some of the incredible feats and some of the incredible statistics that some guys have put up in a 162-game season. I mean, if you think about it, staying consistent for 60 games is not that hard in baseball for an MLB player. Staying consistent for 162 games year in and year out, that is much harder. That is way, way, way harder. So to wrap it all up with that, I just really think that there will always be an asterisk no matter what you look at, no matter who you talk to. I think people will, it will obviously be split, but I think for the most part, there is going to be some sort of cloud hanging over the season, if you will, that will always be the big question of, what would have happened if there was a normal season? Will this ever affect the rest of baseball? And how are we going to view this moving forward? So that's going to wrap that up for segment number 2. Coming up here next on the GSMC Baseball Podcast, I will continue the theme of baseball after COVID, if you will, this time focusing on the minor leagues and what the future holds for farm systems and what this newly established taxi squad means for the players and up-and-coming players in the future as well. So don't go anywhere, folks, because we will be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome back from our commercial break here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. We hope you've been enjoying the first half of the show. It's been really fun having all of you join me today. I'm Jack Ridenour, and if you were just joining us, I just wrapped up segment number 2, a really great topic about the historical significance of this MLB season with the shortening of the season due to the pandemic and how it will be viewed historically in the record books. Now, in segment 3, I want to continue this theme of baseball after COVID by talking about the minor leagues and what could happen to the farm systems down the road. The minor league season has been canceled. As we know, the season was canceled back on June 30th, and this was honestly leading up. I mean, there was already about 1,000 minor league players that were cut back in May. A lot of the players had stopped receiving their $400 a week paychecks from the major leagues back in May as well. Some teams have decided to continue to pay their guys in full all the way through August, but there's been a lot of teams that have completely terminated that payment of their players long time ago, really back in May. And with the season being canceled, it's going to pose a ginormous financial issue for these teams because these teams, they really drive off of ticket sales. They drive off those promotional events, those family nights, so on and so forth. And if there are no games, these teams are going to lose a wild amount of money that could be detrimental to really their existence, in all honesty. The minor leagues have already been preparing for cuts like these, though, because last year, which I remember it coming out, and I was just so floored and mind blown that this many teams were being cut. 42 minor league baseball teams were cut last year, and they've already discussed having 40 more teams cut by 2021. So right there, by the time 2022 rolls around, we're going to be without 80 minor league teams. There's going to be 80 fewer minor league teams in the farm system. So that's going to pose an issue for teams to go and scout. How are teams going to go now find, the talent within their affiliation, within their organization? They're going to be, put at a very, bare minimum amount of players. I mean, they've already started to reduce the amount of draft rounds in the MLB draft from 40 to 5. So now the pool of prospects and potential players is really dwindling down and starting to shorten. So, there could be a lot of things that could happen because of that. And again, although this is something that has been coming for the minor leagues for quite some time, there's been a lot of talk about this. COVID-19 has made it much worse because these players are now being cut and affected. And I'm not saying that the guys on the teams that were cut weren't affected, but a lot of these players this year that were not aware that they'd be cut and the pandemic is rolling through, I mean, that's presenting a big-time issue for these guys. And now the question I ask is, what will happen to the minors in the future? With teams being cut, and like I said, the draft rounds being shrunk down to 40, or from 40 rounds to 5 rounds, it's not going to be the same minor leagues that we are used to seeing in previous years. This reduction in teams and players, I feel, is a way for the teams in the league to really try and focus on the talent pool, really try and hone in and directly focus on, those AAA guys, those high-end, high draft picks, those high prospects that are going to really pan out and they're going to become really good players. Because, again, in all honesty, although I'm a big minor league guy and I love the minor leagues and I always will, there's been many instances where I said, there's just too many teams. And now I'm not saying that they should cut the amount of teams that they're getting rid of. I mean, I think that's a little bit aggressive. I think that's a little bit overboard. I mean, having 80 teams being nixed completely, I think that's a little much. But I do think that there are a lot of single-A teams. I mean, there's so many single-A and Class A and Rookie A advanced teams that those guys, they don't really make it out past rookie ball or single A. I mean, and if they do, it's a long haul for them to eventually get to the majors. It's those guys that are going in those, first 5 rounds, just like there's going to be 5 rounds now in the MLB draft. Those guys are going, really high in the draft and being selected very high. Those are the guys that are going to pan out and have very, very good careers. Now, I've talked to a few minor league players, actually, and they have said that there is a lot of unknown. And this makes me raise the question, if the minor league farm systems begin to shrink even more, and like I said, the draft rounds continue to decrease as they've already drastically decreased, we could see a period of time where either the minor leagues become very slim and there's very slim pickings in the minors and they have limited numbers, or it could force teams to really scout players even harder and making the minors much more competitive. So there's 2 ways of looking at this. Either the talent will go down because there's just going to be not as many guys available to pick from, or it's going to heighten it and it's going to make it much more intense and much more challenging for a guy, which will ultimately bring out the best in each player, and it's going to be much more challenging for guys to be called up to the majors each and every year now that there's going to be fewer and fewer players. Here's another point and another angle to look at it. There are many other minor leagues in the country. There are independent leagues, there's the Frontier League, so on and so forth, and we could potentially see an influx of players from the minor leagues, from the MILB, go and join those teams. And there are a few independent leagues that could start to see an increase in some of those prospects. Like I mentioned, the Frontier League, but there's also the American Association, the Atlanta League, just a couple leagues to throw out there. And there actually have been instances where there have been players that were signed from these leagues and from these minor league teams onto major league teams. So it's not a completely far-fetched idea. There are guys out there that can definitely make a career out of themselves if they come from one of these independent or frontier leagues. Here where I'm located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, not too far away, we've got the Washington Wild Things. And they have always been a very popular team in the area and a team that seems to really get a lot of good talent. And I've often wondered, since I've lived in Pittsburgh, are there going to be guys, or could there ever be guys that get drafted or get pulled up off of those teams and onto major league teams? Well, after I read this article, I kind of did a little bit more research and I did a little bit more background checking. I came to find out that there's actually a ton of guys, and much more than I originally thought, that have been signed to the major leagues from these minor league teams. So I'll give a prime example, a guy that I think a lot of people might have heard of in the baseball world if you're a big baseball fan, David Peralta. He's had a very nice career playing for the Arizona Diamondbacks, has been a very productive player, has done a really nice job. He was a member of the Independent League and played for the Rio Grande Valley Whitewigs, the Wichita Wingnuts, and the Amarillo Sox before ultimately being signed by the Diamondbacks in 2013. He was originally signed by the St. Louis Cardinals, and this is what's very interesting. He was actually released by them. So he wasn't even able to get noticed by the major leagues coming out of the minors, coming out of an affiliated league. He had to go to an independent league to try and make some noise for himself and try to really make a name for himself. And so, again, this is a guy that's a perfect example of someone who, without the opportunity to continue to play through the independent league, I mean, he could potentially not have a job. He could not have, a job in baseball right now. So it is very possible for teams and not for teams, but for players, that they can make it onto a minor league team or on a major league team. So it'll be, again, we'll see if there's going to be any sort of instances of that happening. I came across an article, like I mentioned, written by Jeff Zimmerman of the Hardball Times, and he stated that on average there seems to be around 2 players per team that get signed by major league teams during the year, which surprisingly enough I think is a really good number. I mean, I would have guessed it would have been less. You never hear about these teams or leagues, and they don't get the publicity or the attention, so I feel major league scouts, they'd rather go watch their affiliates. But it seems like there is actually a much more of an outpour and a much more of a turnout for these independent leagues than I thought, and it seems to be a really good thing for these guys that are coming out of independent leagues that are not typical minor league leagues, if you will, or typical farm systems affiliated leagues. And these leagues could also turn into very competitive leagues, really. I mean, you think about it. Guys that are usually getting drafted in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th rounds. Those guys are, now we're going into even guys that are going to usually go in the 10th or 15th round. Those guys are still very good baseball players, but now they're not going to be able to be taken. I mean, it's going to really start to weed out the weak, if you will, in the draft. And guys that are usually going in those later rounds, they're going to start falling onto those independent league teams. They're going to start falling onto those rosters, and in a couple of years from now, we could potentially see an instance where these minor leagues actually become very competitive. They become very exciting to watch. And something else that I noticed in the article that jumped out at me, I was very fascinated with, and I was very intrigued by it. Out of the 30 MLB teams between the years of 2013 and 2015, the Diamondbacks had the highest number of previous independent league players on their roster, and they had signed the highest number of players from that league, with a total of 34 guys going to the D-backs. I mean, that is a high number of guys to come from one independent league. That is a large number of people to come from. And so it was also very interesting to see that actually these minor league teams, they make money off of these off of these major league teams when they come and try and take players. So for example, it's about $4,000 for an MLB team to pay one of these minor league teams for one of their players. They get about $3,000 for the teams, and then about $1,000 goes to the leagues. So these teams could very well be kind of a little outlet for major league teams to go outside of house, if you will, and go and find some other talent for a very, very low price. As a result, the minor leagues start to get a little bit more money from the major leagues, and if they start to see that more and more guys are actually coming out of the minor leagues and are starting to actually, make a name for themselves and make a career, major league teams are going to continue to do it much, much more. I mean, if it's where the talent's going to be, the major league scouts, they're all going to be there. All the coaches, all the managers, they're going to be there wanting to watch and wanting to see those guys play in that minor league system, because again, it's going to be out of house. They're not going to be able to control what these guys are doing with like they usually can in the farm systems. So they'll be able to have a completely unbiased opinion, and it will make it even more challenging for guys that are in those leagues to get noticed, and as a result, it will just increase the level of play and the talent. And now with the coronavirus this year ending the minor league season, it has forced the Major League Baseball to implement something that has been in the news for a while now, which is these taxi squads. Now, these taxi squads are very fascinating, and here's why. 20-man rosters that are basically like reserve teams. So essentially, if anybody on the 40-man roster this year for the MLB teams, for the big league teams, if anybody gets sick, injured, so on and so forth, they're going to basically go to this reserve team, and they're just going to pull guys up from this team, and it's just like it's almost like, a G League team in the basketball, or, however you want to look at it. It's just kind of like a supplemental developmental team. And these guys are going to, continue to work out, continue to stay ready, continue to practice and train. But once their number's called, they're going to be called up to the major leagues, and they're going to be, potentially replacing guys that are, normally everyday starters and guys that have big time impacts on their rosters. And there's a lot of prospects that have the potential to be called up from the majors from these taxi squads. I mean, I talked to a buddy of mine who knows somebody who just got called up from the taxi squad, or is on the taxi squad and could be called up from it. And I mean, he's already said that it's just, it's surreal. It's such an unbelievable experience that he can't even believe it's going on. And it often makes me wonder, what this would be like for a minor league player right now. Everything that's been going on, you're kind of the cream of the crop, if you will, being selected to these taxi squads. I mean, it's kind of like, I like to compare it, and I don't know if this will be a fair comparison or not, but kind of like when you have a varsity team and every now and again the coach lets the JV guys, come up and play. And sometimes those JV guys, they've got a huge impact and they come out on the court, on the field, wherever, and they make a difference. So we could see, again, an instance where somebody from the taxi squad kind of rises up out of nowhere, comes through the rankings, and really makes a name for themselves, really puts themselves on the map, and people, all of a sudden, all the light and all the attention will be on them. So a couple guys to mention, and I think to definitely make note of and to be aware of in the coming years. I'll kick it off. First guy is Brady Singer, right-handed pitcher for the Kansas City Royals, and he's got a lot of upside. I mean, 18th overall pick by the Royals in 2018. He was a part of the Wilmington Blue Rocks in his first year of the minors in 2019, the single-A team for the Royals. Part of the All-Star Futures game. He's 6'5", 210, long frame. He's got a really nice fastball, touches around 95, 96, throws hard, and he's got a really good build for a pitcher. He needs to add a third pitch, though. He's got really two main fastballs that he uses, kind of a rising four-seamer and then a two-seamer that seems to dip down a little bit. He adds that changeup in, or he adds some sort of off-speed, and he's going to be dangerous. I mean, he could be a serious hurler in the year, or in the MLB for years to come, in all honesty. So that's a guy to definitely make note of and to definitely watch out for, because, I mean, the Royals, they're a team that you never know with them. You don't know. I mean, they won the World Series in 2015. They went to back-to-back World Series. They're kind of one of those teams that, if they're going to be, they're one of those window teams, I like to call them. They're in their window for 2 or 3 years, and they have to take advantage of it. And if they don't, then that's all that's all she wrote for them. And they really did a nice job at taking advantage of that window. I mean, going to back-to-back World Series and winning one of them, they took full advantage of that. So this is a team that could be building a big farm system, starting to build some young talent within the organization, and that could really benefit this organization and this team for years to come. So the second guy I want to talk about is in the White Sox organization. And like I mentioned earlier about them, they've got a lot of young talent, and this is one of the rising stars in the organization, and it's Nick Madrigal, second baseman in the White Sox organization. And again, I bring him up because Tim Anderson is over at shortstop, and he had an unbelievable year. I mean, he batted .335, was batting champion in the AL, and they just need a second baseman right there just to play off of him. They need a really solid second baseman to play off of him. He's got a great bat. He's got a really, really quick swing. He's played for numerous minor league teams, but he's really been floating around the AAA system for the last couple years, and he's done a great job. I mean, he's proven that he can perform at that highest level of the minors. He's been able to get it done. He's been able to, definitely have a lot of success as somebody who, normally, would I say, kind of just a typical second baseman nowadays. I mean, you don't really hear of any like big time powerful. I mean, you got DJ LeMahieu, sure. You got other guys that have been very prominent, but I mean, in recent years, not so much. And so he could be a guy that could rise up, could really be a good piece for that middle infield for the White Sox and add another dynamic and be able to play off of Tim Anderson, who's over at shortstop. Now, the third guy I want to talk about is on the Oakland Athletics, and this is another team that I think does a fantastic job at developing talent in-house, in their own farm systems. They do a really, really, really nice job of it, and they've really proven that it doesn't take the big superstars to win. I mean, they're one of these teams that I was also combing through the internet and I saw kind of a ranking or a tier of different MLB teams. And the Athletics were like in the third tier. And I was very shocked by that. But I honestly thought about it a little bit more and I realized they do things in a very unconventional way. They don't go out and try and get those big name free agents, those guys that are putting up unbelievable numbers. They're not putting up, blockbuster trades. They're developing talent inside of their organization. They're going out and getting added pieces that they would normally, not be able to get, but they're getting them for, a fraction of what they normally would or for, a very good price. And so this guy for the Athletics, I think, is going to be, a very promising player. That's Sean Murphy, catcher for them. And again, you got to remember the name because he was actually on the A's roster last year. He was their starting catcher in the wild card game. So he's a minor league guy that's had experience. He's had experience also at, one of the biggest stages in all of sports, the wild card, the postseason, playoffs. And he was able to bounce around in AAA, like I mentioned, for a little bit, being signed by the A's eventually. And then he actually, fun fact, he hit his first career home run in his MLB debut. I mean, I've always heard about guys that have, their first game, their first at-bat, their first swing, whatever, and they hit a home run. That's got to be such an exhilarating, such a life-changing experience, really. I mean, that's got to be something that you can't ever get out of your mind. I mean, it's etched in your head forever, and it will never, ever go away. It'll never, ever disappear, and it'll be something that will stay with you forever. So he's a guy that is very young, rising up very quickly of the rankings in the A's organization, and there are teams that, they're really known for developing talent in-house, not just the Athletics, but there's other teams that have also done it. I mean, you hear about the Padres. They've got a great minor league system. The Rays have a fantastic minor league system. The White Sox, again, I keep going back to the White Sox. There's just a lot that could happen this year. And again, with these taxi squads, it makes you kind of wonder, what kind of dynamic will that throw in? A couple guys get injured. All of a sudden you've got, a couple replacements over in the infield, maybe a guy behind the plate as a catcher or whatever. You never know. There could be a guy that has an unbelievable year as a taxi squad guy, and he rises up and all of a sudden, you're hearing his name left and right, and it's like, who is this guy? We haven't even heard of him. And it could, be the start to some people's careers. It could be the beginning of some players, very illustrious careers. It just takes somebody one shot and one opportunity to really just get that chance and then just run with it. And so it just takes that one opportunity for them, whether it's somebody getting sick or somebody going down with an injury or somebody opting not to play, somebody who wants to sit out, whatever. These guys, they're going to be ready. They're taxi squad guys. They're minor league guys. They're going to, have their feet, planted on the ground, ready to take off. Their cleats are going to be laced up. They're going to be excited to play. Plus, not to mention, their season's been canceled. So no matter what, it's not like they've got really anything to fall back on. And on top of it, they already know that they're being called up to this very high level and that they're literally right there at the major league level. Like they're literally knocking at the door. And it's going to make some guys even hungrier and want it even more determined. And when you have that, again, it brings out all the more talent and all the more ability out of guys. So the minor leagues down the road, it'll be very interesting. I think that we're definitely going to see a lot of Frontier League, American Association, Independent League, so on and so forth players that start to come up. I mean, we could even start seeing a day where, you never know, some of these MLB teams, they start getting affiliated with these Independent League teams and these other, offshoot minor league associations that aren't affiliated with them and aren't necessarily part of the Major League Baseball Association. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with minors because, again, you have to feel really bad for these guys. I mean, they already don't get paid much as it is. Their season's been canceled, and then they haven't been getting paid for anything. So, I mean, me personally, I feel really bad for them. I mean, my heart really goes out to those guys because they work their tails off. Again, I know a lot of guys that are in the minors, and I couldn't imagine what they're going through right now. I mean, the sport that you love and the sport that you've grown up enjoying, and now you're trying to make a career of it, it's getting there's a big time obstacle in the road that they really have to overcome right now, but it's completely out of their control. And that's what's really unfortunate is that this is really out of everybody's control. And so as a result, hopefully down the road, maybe we'll start to see, more and more minor league systems in the majors start to develop even more talent, and maybe there'll be a little bit more of a focus on their farm systems, and maybe some of these guys that aren't, with jobs anymore and that have, unfortunately aren't on rosters anymore, maybe they'll start getting picked up by these other teams. And again, we'll start to see, maybe a steady incline and gradual buildup of these teams and see them continue to progress and keep getting better and better. And all of a sudden you've got these outside minor league leagues that are very competitive. Who knows? Maybe you'll start getting people to actually watch them. For an instance, we've already got other sports that have other semi-professional leagues that people are interested in, that people want to watch, and are taking advantage of that. And so these other minor league teams, they also need to do the same thing. They need to kind of take advantage of that, hey, these guys are now available. Let's go out and get them. Let's go see what players have been, released, what players have been cut, what players have been gotten rid of, and we can scoop them up, put them on our roster. Now all of a sudden you're going to bring attention to you. Major league teams are going to start coming your way. And again, these teams get paid. These teams are getting paid for these players. So as a result, it's going to want it, they're going to want that all the more. They're going to, and the more money, the more funding, the more publicity, and the more publicity, the better notoriety your team is going to get. So again, goes back to the whole point of if these minor league leagues can capitalize on these guys getting cut out of the majors, then it could really benefit them. And honestly, again, it could really benefit the major leagues. They can go to these other leagues and they can get guys for pennies. These teams would be paying $4,000 for a contract, as opposed to some of these teams that are paying some guys tens of millions of dollars on a yearly basis. So it'll be a fraction of what they can get them for. They can all of a sudden put them into their affiliation, put them in their farm system, and start to develop them and start to, really work with them and turn them into legitimate professional baseball players and start to develop the talent a little bit more. So there's going to be a lot that is going to be moving forward with the minors. There's going to be a lot of things moving in that direction and what's going to be circulating around them. But again, it's going to be fascinating. I'm excited to see what happens, and I'm really hopeful that there are some minor league guys out there that can hopefully get back onto some teams sooner rather than later. Again, folks, it was another great segment here today. Thanks for sticking around and tuning in here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcasting Network. We're going to take a quick break here, folks, but don't change that channel. We've got a great final segment for you all, as I'll be ranking my top 3 greatest worst to first year turnarounds in MLB history and how those team seasons ended after finishing in last place the year before. I'm Jack Ridenauer, and we will be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup finals.
Listen now.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for sticking around for the fourth and final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still here, and I've got a really good final segment for you all tuning in at home. Now, something that has been a very infrequent instance to occur in the baseball world is this phenomenon of the, quote, worst to first idea. Now, basically where a team finishes dead last the year before only to come back the next year and finish in first or even better, win the World Series. So I want to rank my top 3 greatest worst to first turnaround in MLB history. And to kick it off, I have to tip my hat to this team, as they were an expansion team that made an incredible turnaround in a year. And before I get into it, expansion teams are teams that I've always have really felt bad for in the beginning. when you first start out as an expansion team, you're first getting your feet wet into a new league. You're kind of the new kid on the block. You don't really know what to do. It's kind of awkward waters to navigate around in. And very infrequently do you see teams come just out of nowhere and immediately have, an unbelievable winning season or even winning a championship in their first year as an organization, as an expansion team. So the first team I want to highlight, who's actually later on, we'll get into, how much success that they've actually had and in the recent years when they were a first expansion team, but that's the 1998 Arizona Diamondbacks. Now, they had a terrible inaugural season. That was their first ever season as a team. They went 65-97 on the year, and they finished in dead last in the division. They didn't have anyone hitting higher than 280 on the starting lineup, and their highest being Devin White at 279. So you've got a team right there that doesn't have one guy hitting at a 280 clip. That's just a recipe for a losing season. No question about it. Especially nowadays, you need a guy that, again, batting average is not looked at as it was back then. But if you don't have a guy that's at least hitting, high 200s, low 300s, and a lot of guys with really good OPSs nowadays, you're really in trouble. You are going to be struggling mightily from the plate and offensively in a season. And, as an expansion team, it was very challenging for them to come into a new league as a new team and really try and perform at a high level immediately. It was something that was not easy for them to do. Many teams have struggled with it early on in their careers. But the next year in 1999, now this was actually very impressive. I was very, very, very shocked by this, quite frankly. And that was that the following year, they wound up finishing the season obviously first in the division, but they won 100 games that season. They went from 65-97 to winning 100 total games. That's an incredible turnaround. That's an over, 30, 35 game improvement in just a season. Not many teams can even make a 20-game improvement in wins in 1 year. That's a very challenging feat to overcome for sure. And they won the division actually by a very large margin, a total of 14 games that separated them from the second place team. And they would enter the first round of the playoffs taking on the New York Mets. Now, back then, the Mets, they weren't quite the team as we know them, for the last couple of years, although the Mets have actually been very good. Last year, they were a lot better last year. They've got a lot of young guys. Again, probably a team that I'll be talking about in the coming weeks, in the future, because they've got a lot of potential, like the White Sox, like the Pirates. But again, I don't want to keep bringing up previous segments. The Mets definitely had their number. It was really a great run by the Diamondbacks and a great turnaround. They were able to win 100 games the following year, but they all ultimately lost in the divisional round 3-1 against the Mets. And it was a really, really tough loss for the Diamondbacks for sure. Game 4 coming off, or Game 4 finished in a walk-off fashion with a walk-off home run in the bottom of the 10th inning. Now, Randy Johnson, who Hall of Fame pitcher we all know very well, went on to win the Cy Young that year for the Diamondbacks, and they really proved to be a legitimate contender after that. A few years later, they would actually win their first and only World Series championship over the New York Yankees in 2001. And a replay I think that a lot of us have seen that is very, very famous is Craig Counsell hitting that single and winning it for the Diamondbacks in the World Series. It's probably one of the most memorable and most captured moments in all of baseball history, especially in all of World Series history. And then, later on in this segment, we're going to get into a World Series that had a profound impact on the game of baseball and was a historical game, to say the least. But, I got to tip my hat off to the Diamondbacks. They've been able to really turn things around for their franchise. Again, as an expansion team, it's hard to make any sort of mark in that new league. It's really, really tough. And they were able to do it pretty quickly. Within, 5 years of existing, they all of a sudden win a World Series. They go to a championship series, a couple divisional championships, and they really turn around from that dismal beginning that they had in that first year of existence. So kudos to the Diamondbacks. Great job by them. So they're my number 3 team. But now the number 2 team is a classic example of a great worst to first turnaround team. And the year it happened, actually, there were 2 teams that had an impressive worst to first turnaround, and one of them was the 1990-1991 Atlanta Braves. Now the Braves Braves, I mean, they were pretty bad in 1990. They're very similar, actually the exact same record as the Diamondbacks had in their 1998 season, 65-97, and it was a mighty struggle for Atlanta. I mean, back then they were in the NL West division, so they were, I mean, with the Dodgers, with the Giants, they were with some very, very good teams, and they never once were in first place the entire year. They were behind as many games as 33 they were 33 games under 500. Just a terrible season for the Braves, to say the least. I mean, the most runs they actually gave up that year was 23 in a game, and that was on June 8th against the Giants that season. I mean, just a brutal 1990 season for Atlanta. Now, in 1991, things would completely flip around for the Braves. I mean, they do pretty much the impossible. They became the first ever National League team to go from last place the one year to becoming the finishing in first place the following year. And it's a task that had never been done before up until that time. So something that a monumental feat that they were able to overcome. And they were able to, get over that hump, really, and they were able to put behind that really tough year because, again, like I said before, there are teams out there and there are teams in the major leagues right now that no matter what it is, they just seem to get in almost a rut. And they're just for 10, 15 years. I mean, it's kind of like the Orioles. The Orioles, I mean, they've been okay here and there. They've made a couple little playoff leaps, if you will. I don't want to say any jumps because it hasn't been anything crazy. But they've just been a team that's just not done anything, and they're just kind of churning in the same water, and they're not going anywhere. And so it's very admirable to see teams that are able to make some sort of massive turnaround in a year, 2 years, whatever it might be, but any sort of just complete transformation as a franchise, it's hard to do. And it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of development of talent, it takes a lot of just expertise in your front office and a lot of trust from, the top down, from the front office, the GM, the people up in the office to the people down in the dugout, like the managers, the players, and so on and so forth. So the Braves, again, like the D-backs, they had a terrible, terrible season, finished under, 33 games under 500, and now they come back in 1991, first in the division. They plow through the playoffs, get into the NLCS actually, and they take on the Pittsburgh Pirates of all teams. And these were Pirates teams back then, 1990, 1991, 1992 teams that were very good. I mean, the Barry Bonds era, they had a lot of really talented teams. I know Three Rivers Stadium was roaring back in those days. And they were able to actually win the deciding Game 7 and eventually found themselves running into the Minnesota Twins. So they take down the Pirates in the NLCS initially, knocked them off, able to get to the Twins in the World Series. First time the Braves had been in the World Series for quite some time, and this would actually be the beginning of a very long-standing line of success by the Braves as they went on to win 14 consecutive titles in the West Division. And they were, up until before then, they had not won one in quite some time, and they were able to go on after that and win 14 straight. So again, a perfect example of a team that's able to put behind the past, put behind the previous season, and is able to move on, continue forward, and really progress and improve. And that is ultimately what these teams want to do is, they want to build off of those brutal seasons that they have the year before, come back the next year and try and capitalize as much as they can. The Twins and the Braves now, they went back and forth. Minnesota jumped out to a quick 2-0 series lead. The Braves immediately answered, though. They won 3 straight games, and they actually found themselves one game away from the unthinkable, winning the World Series after finishing in last place the year before. With games, going into extra innings, it was setting up to be a very memorable finish for sure. And so in Game 7, there was a 0-0 tie heading into the bottom of the 10th. I mean, it was a stalemate. There was a lot of different records that went on this World Series, and it was an incredible pitching duel between Brave star John Smoltz, a very, very young John Smoltz, I should say, and Twins ace Jack Morris. Jack Morris was a great pitcher back in the day for Minnesota. He actually threw a 10-inning complete game in this one. I'll get into that one a little bit soon also. I might have given away the number 1 pick, but I guess you're going to have to stick around and see. The game went into extras, like I mentioned, and was decided after a pinch hit game-winning single by Gene Larkin of the Twins, and ultimately knocked the Braves out of the World Series in what would go down as one of the greatest and most memorable World Series in baseball history. I mean, there's a lot that happened in the 90s of baseball, and I feel like, I was looking at a lot of these teams that made some improbable turnarounds in a year. A lot of these teams were in the 90s. I mean, the Diamondbacks, the Braves and this number one team that I'm about to mention, they were all 90s teams. So, back then guys wanted to capitalize. Guys wanted to come back and prove to not only themselves, to their organization, to the fans, to the city, but to the league that they could really make some sort of a comeback and make some sort of a run for themselves the following year. Now, that will not be the last we hear about the Twins in this segment, because the number one team to have the greatest worst to first year turnaround in baseball history is by none other than that exact same Twins team. Yes, that exact same thing happened for the Twins on the other side of the MLB in the AL as opposed to the Braves being in the NL. Literally, the Twins and the Braves are two teams that it's the only time ever where two teams were able to finish in last place the year before and then go out the next year, win, be first place in their respective divisions, and go to the World Series and play each other. That was, think about that. How coincidental is that the two teams that had two of the worst seasons the year before, they were the laughingstock of the major leagues. It would be like nowadays if the Marlins and, say, I can't even think of a team right now, the Marlins and the Mariners. I'm not saying the Mariners are a laughingstock, but they're just a team that just jumped out to my mind. Imagine those two teams finishing in dead last the year, last year, 2 years ago. And then all of a sudden, the following year, this year, maybe they finish in last place, and then the next year, they make some improbable turnaround. Both teams finish in first place and wind up meeting in the World Series. That's just so picturesque. It's almost like it was plotted, it was planned or something. It's almost too perfect to imagine, right? So the Twins in 1990 were not as bad as the D-backs or the Braves were in their respective down years, but nevertheless, they still wound up finishing in last place in the AL West. And what they were at the time, they were a 74 and 88 team back then, and again, not as bad as the D-backs, but that's 14 games under 500. You don't want to be, that far below the 500 mark, especially if, you've got a lot of ground to cover. You've got a lot of ground to make up in those seasons. Now, they actually had some very good players on this team that hit very, very well that year, one of them being future Hall of Famer Kirby Puckett, who later on in this segment I will share about what he did in that monumental run in 1991. He was vital to their success. He's a Hall of Fame baseball player, one of the best Twins players of all time. He's got numerous franchise records. He hit .298 that year, 12 homers, 80 RBIs, and they were at the worst 17 games under 500, and they fell as far as 30 games out of first place in the division. And in the opening month of baseball, this was absolutely flooring. They only compiled 7 total wins in the first month of baseball. The following year proved to be a miraculous turnaround by the Twins, coming back with a 95 and 67 finish, which was good for first in the West, and they actually started out the 1991 season on a really bad note. That was also another very odd coincidental thing that I noticed. They were 2-9 in their first 11 games. So imagine if you're a Twins fan sitting at a game, you're going back, okay, it's going to be a new season, 1991, we've got this. Things are going to turn around, things are going to be on the up and up for us. And all of a sudden, the first 11 games you watch, they are only winning 2. Right there, you're like, wow, this could probably turn into the same thing that happened last year. I'm literally watching deja vu. I'm living in a deja vu season right now. The Twins seem just completely out of it. They seem to be putting together the similar season. Was going to be a disaster, it looked like, but they were able to turn it around. It was almost like a flip of the switch that they were able to improve their year. In June alone, they were 19-1 through the first 20 games of the month, putting together a season-long and what is still today a franchise record 15-game winning streak to start that month. If you're going out that hot in 1 month of baseball, you're already putting yourself way ahead of the curve. And they really did that. They did a great job at, piling together a whole bunch of runs that was able to propel them into, first place and into a really good spot right before the All-Star break. That winning streak, again, like I said, is still the longest in Twins history, and they continued to play very well the rest of the season, carried that play well into the postseason. They had a lot of young talent that was able to, mix well with that veteran talent with Kirby Puckett. They had the Rookie of the Year that year and Chuck Knobloch. A lot of great talent, a lot of really good players, and so that mix of old and young is what really proved to be a great mix for the Twins. And I think a lot of teams still try and use that dynamic, that mentality. They want those young guys to take any sort of bits of information they can from those older players. And those older players, I mean, they've been there, they've done it, they've got the experience, they've gotten all the jitters out of the way, they've gotten all the nerves out of the way. They know what it's like to perform at those huge moments and at those huge stages, whereas those young guys, not so much. And so the Twins, it was really great that the Twins were able to, those veteran guys came back, they were able to kind of gather themselves, get themselves ready for 1991. They bring in some fresh new players, kind of a fresh look, but still keep some very, consistent and familiar faces on that team as well. And I think that is what really proved to be a lot of their success in that 1991 season. Now, they continue to mow through the season, get into the playoffs, and they're going up against the Toronto Blue Jays in the ALCS. Now, the Twins, I mean, again, they were really good that year. The Blue Jays, that was starting to be kind of when the Blue Jays started their little bit of a run. I mean, there was an early part of the 90s where they went to a couple World Series. They actually won one of the World Series during the 90s as well. And, I mean, they were able to really put together a little bit of a run themselves. So this is kind of the beginning for the Blue Jays also. Now, the Blue Jays, they were able to answer after the Twins opened up the series with a win against Toronto. The Blue Jays answer right back with a win of their own. So things are tied up after Game 2. So they are ultimately, going into Game 3, things are even, things are all knotted up. Twins are able to come out on top, win Game 3, take the series lead 2-1, and they ultimately win the series 4-1 in the end. And it was, one of the games that really kind of decided it all was one of the extra inning games. And we'll hear in this next part of this segment about, what kind of extra innings and what kind of games that the Twins and this team, again, that we already mentioned, the Atlanta Braves, had to go through and what they endured during that World Series. I mean, the ESPN ranked it as the #1 greatest World Series of all time. That is how prominent and how important this World Series was. I mean, if ESPN is going out on their 100th anniversary of just greatest, World Series performances, greatest World Series ever, that's #1. I mean, there was, and I'll get into all the records that were broken and all the firsts that happened, so on and so forth. Now, again, going back to the World Series, they get through the ALCS. The Twins, again, play against the Atlanta Braves. And like I had mentioned, both of these teams, this was the first time that this had ever happened where two teams would finish in dead last the year before and then go on the next year, be first in their respectful divisions, and then go to the World Series and actually play each other. Pretty incredible, again, if you think about it. I mean, just how coincidental that is. And this World Series, like I mentioned, is considered to be one of the greatest ever, and the series featured 5 of the 7 games being decided by 1 run and 3 of the games going into extra innings. So, every single game you watch, I mean, there's been a lot of really great World Series in my lifetime that I feel, have stuck out. And one of them being, and it's not because of just the closeness in games and the just, 1-run differences and, 1-0 games and this, that, and the other, but it was the Giants, it was the Astros Dodgers a couple years ago when the Astros and Dodgers were, there was those wild home run derby games that they were going on in the World Series with guys just hitting bombs left and right. I mean, it just seemed like everything they made contact with was leaving the park. I remember watching the game at a friend's house, and I was just on my phone, and every time I heard the crack of the bat, I looked up, and the ball seemed to be leaving the park. And it happened about 3 or 4 times, and I just said, are they doing something to the ball? I mean, are they doing something to the bat? I mean, this is unbelievable. So I'm sure people, again, back then were probably very mesmerized by how close these two teams were playing. And also, it goes to show you how evenly matched they were. I mean, if they're going and playing 5 of the 7 games and then they're only being decided by 1 run and 3 of the games going into extra innings, I mean, that's nearly half the games that are having to go into essentially, extra time and overtime or extra innings, whatever you want to call it. That's a lot. That is a lot of tense, down to the wire, edge of the seat type of baseball, and that's what you want to watch in the Fall Classic and in the World Series. That is exactly what you want to watch. Now, the only significant victory by either team was the Braves, and it was a 14-5 Game 5 victory for them. Game 6, now this is where things get really interesting in the series. Game 6 was a pivotal game for the Twins as they faced elimination heading into the game. I mean, their backs were against the wall. Again, like I mentioned, for #2 for the Atlanta Braves, and I kind of gave it away a little bit, but again, I'm giving it from the Twins' point of view now because I ranked them #1 a little bit ahead of the Braves. They go into that game facing elimination. Teams, went back and forth, which seemed to be really the theme of the entire World Series. So that Game 6, it was pivotal. It was a complete series changer for the entire World Series. Scores tied at 3 heading into extra innings. Going into the bottom of the 11th, up at bat comes Kirby Puckett. Typical Hall of Fame guy, right on cue, perfect timing, perfect scenario, backs against the wall, nothing really to lose, facing elimination. You've got your Hall of Fame player up at bat in the extra innings of a World Series game. I don't think you can write that any better. I don't think that you could lay that out, or you could see that happening or see that really playing out in any other way except, that's just perfect timing. That is just so picturesque that, it was like it was meant to be, really. And again, Kirby Puckett had mentioned right before he had gotten into the batter's box and he went up to bat that he was going to actually try and bunt on. He was going to try and bunt onto base and try and just get somebody on base. Chili Davis, who was one of the big power hitters for the Twins at the time, told him, hey man, don't do that. Forget that. Just go out and hit one out of the park. Hit this so we can all go home. So Puckett goes up to the plate, saw a pitch he liked, and he sent that one over the fence, and the iconic moment of Puckett rounding first base, leaping in the air, pumping his fists in one of the most iconic moments in baseball history, no question. Those are famous picturesque moments that are etched in baseball history and in baseball lore forever. They will never go anywhere. They will never die. They will never, vanish or anything. Those are some of that's one of the most monumental and one of the most memorable moments in World Series history. Kirby Puckett rounding first base after he hits that Game 6 winning home run. It completely changed the tide. You've got a tied series now, 3-3. Going into Game 7, again, Braves are throwing their ace, John Smoltz, and Jack Morris is on the mound for the Twins. So Game 7, again, is going to be a deciding factor. Goes throughout the entire game, a 0-0 score. Neither team scored the entire game. They're going into the 10th inning, and Smoltz had actually exited the game earlier, and he was a little bit younger, a little bit more inexperienced, and veteran Jack Morris was very defiant. And there was actually a little story about it behind where Jack Morris was just literally arguing with the manager the entire time, saying, I'm not getting out of this game. I'm not leaving. You're not taking me out of this game. And John Smoltz went back and said, hey, if I had been a little bit older and had a little bit better of a connection with Bobby Cox back then, and a little bit more of a familiarity like Jack Morris did with his manager, he said, I probably would have done the same thing. I probably would have demanded the same thing to stay in the game. But again, inexperience versus experience, and we kind of see what kind of happened there. And again, this is just a very memorable moment and a very memorable World Series. Jack Morris winds up picking up the complete game victory in 10 innings. They eventually win the game in a 1-0 decision, and they were able to win the World Series and, capitalize and really put the icing on the cake for the most incredible turnaround in all of sports history. That is just going from worst to first. That is literally the definition of going worst to first. Being the worst team in your division the year before, coming back the next year and winning the World Series. What better way to respond to a losing record the year before than winning the World Series? That's unbelievable. Now, there's been a lot of records that were broken, and then a lot of things that had not happened for many years up until this World Series. One of them being it was the first World Series since 1962 where the 7th and deciding game had ended in a 1-0 decision. And it was the first World Series game to go into extra innings during the 7th and deciding game since 1939. Again, not many of these World Series games have happened in this fashion. So that is what the uniqueness of it is, and that's what has made it, kind of live in baseball infamy, and it continues to resonate with all fans all throughout the world today. And there's been a ton of other instances of teams making incredible turnarounds in baseball in just a year. A couple of honorable mentions, the 2012-2013 Boston Red Sox. Again, briefly, they were, at the bottom of the AL East. They got rid of a lot of really good players, Adrian Gonzalez, Carl Crawford, Josh Beckett, in that really big blockbuster trade to the Dodgers so many years ago. And after that tough 2012 year, they come back, win 97 games, win the World Series in 2013, and they're really able to capitalize and again, very similar to the Twins, kind of cap off that incredible turnaround. Another team to highlight, 2007-2008 Rays, I mean, they had an improbable turnaround as well. Hired Joe Madden in 2008. The Rays were able to flip their season around. They lost 96 games in 2007, come back in 2008, and they win 97 games, went on to the ALCS, captured their first ever franchise pennant, but they ultimately fell to the World Series champions, Philadelphia Phillies, unfortunately. But again, I mean, those Rays teams back then, they were really great to watch with Evan Longoria and just Ben Zobrist, all of those guys. It was a lot of fun to watch, you know, those kind of unsung teams that you don't usually hear about in the news all the time come out of nowhere and really rise through the rankings of the MLB. So seasons like, you know, the ones those teams had are what make baseball such an awesome sport. Being able to make a change like that in a year, it's impressive that those teams were able to bounce like they did, you know, bounce back like they did, because a lot of teams, I feel, once they find themselves in the bottom of the barrel of the league, it's really hard for them to get out of that mentality. But these teams, they were able to prove that it is possible and that it can happen. So that's going to wrap it up for us here today, folks, on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. I hope you all enjoyed yourselves and were able to take away some of the things from today's episode. There was a lot that was covered, and it was great to have everyone sit down and tune in and take time out of their day to check out the episode. Once again, thank you for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice little review that will really help us. We are always looking for feedback and want to hear what you have to say about the show. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to stay up to date on any news stories that will be shared, information about upcoming episodes, and much more. And as always, folks, thanks again for joining me and tuning in. I'm Jack Ridenauer, signing off from the GSMC Baseball Podcast. And until next time, everyone, have a great night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.